city. Why? So they would tell this story. And they would tell it in an animated fashion about these two people, Adam and Eve. And what it explains, what this story of Adam and Eve is explaining, is this sort of euphoric, paradise-like state that humanity was in when they were simply hunters and gatherers. When they just went around and found everything that was needed, particularly in Mesopotamia because it was so abundant. But then they learned the knowledge of farming and they could never go back. It is very hard to get people, because let's say our entire civilization is wiped out and a few people survive. What's the first thing they start trying to do? Farm. So we need to find a source of food. There isn't any. Okay, let's start our own. We're gonna farm. You can't go back. Once you farm, you cannot go back.
But if you don't know how to farm, that could be a problem.
You learn, but you learn how again.
Yeah,
relearn.
You have to start all over again.
Because we've eaten of that fruit. We know it now. I mean, it's just part of our. It's just such a part of our society that farming, that we always know a little bit about it. I guess unless you're an infant or a small child, I guess you're kind of hopeless. But that's kind of splitting hairs. So, what that was explaining to the first city dwellers, the first civilization, one of the first civilizations which began in Mesopotamia, was explaining that it was this farming. Because what does farming do? When you can grow wheat, wheat's a plant. It's in the ground. It's rooted in the ground. Therefore, it cannot do what? Move. It cannot change its location. And if it's your source of food, if it's a really good source of food and it's your main source of food, what are you going to do? Not move either. You're going to stay where it is. So it kept people in place. And that's when the first communities began to develop. So that's when we get into to the story of Genesis, where we start talking about Cain and Abel, where you have two facets of society. These aren't two individual men. These are two facets of society that were being explained in the story, using Cain and Abel as symbols. Cain was still a hunter-gatherer. He went out and hunted. And he gathered. Hunter-gatherer. You hunt and you're also gathering. So, but Abel collected the nuts of the field, which nuts of the field, they're talking about wheat. He farmed. He took on what his father did and what his mother did, and that was farm. And it was showing that, to explain to these city dwellers, the very first city dwellers, that their way of life was better than the tribes. Because these little children, they may say, well, how come there are people out there that don't live in cities? Well, it doesn't matter, because our way is better, and here's why. Because in the story, remember, Cain didn't produce as much food for sacrifice to God as Abel did, and that made him mad. First person to end it, and he killed his brother. But the point, that's not as much the point as that, killing is wrong, but because you can see that wasn't the point, because God, later in the story, Cain goes off to the land of Nod and knows his wife. Who's this wife? Where did this wife come from? People are wondering, who is this wife? Because that's not the point. The point is that Cain didn't produce as much food for sacrifice as Abel did. And that was to prove the point that their way of life, the sedentary, agricultural way of life, was superior to hunter-gatherer. That was the point of that story. But as you can see, this story goes all the way back to the very beginning of 10,000 years, 12,000 years. This story that still exists today, and the story I'm telling you now, is a story that is so ancient. It's been spoken by so many other languages, but the story is still there. And that ties all the way back into my discussion about words, how words communicate ideas. Even though this language is, or even though the story has been told in thousands of languages, thousands of years, hundreds of nations have all told this story, but it's the same story. That's what's so special about storytelling.
Story of life.
It is. It's a story of humanity. It's not, and I feel bad for people who just sit there and they accept it because it's a much grander story than just the one provided as a testament in the Bible to the creation of humanity. Because what is humanity, really? I mean, that's what it's designed to answer this question. What is humanity? What is humanity? The only thing that makes us special, as you could see by God's initial creation of Adam, having this power of choice, that is what makes us special. We can choose to do what we want to do, when we want to do it.
You could also say that the thing that makes humanity special is its past, and whether you learn from that past.
That's true also. But even when you get into... Quit looking at me like that.
I'm not looking at you like anything.
You're like,
I'm just looking. Well, I'm listening to what you're saying,
but,
and I'm trying to, offer some response.
But even if you look at Adam was the first man. He had no past to tell. To whom would he tell it? God. God knew it. He didn't have to. God created it. He didn't have to tell it to God. But so I think second to that one, the most intrinsic property of humanity is that we can choose to do anything. We have the ability to do anything we want. I mean, within reason. I mean, I can't jump to the moon. That's because I choose to do it.
Yeah.
But we have this power of choice, and that's the
important
thing.
You can do that, but you can do it in your own mind. You can't do it physically.
Well, I'm talking on a physical sense here.
Yeah, I know that.
So that's, when I see people talk about Genesis and they talk about it as if it's a literal account of everything that happened, because I don't doubt that God created life. I mean, the way life works is so miraculous. It defies. There's no other natural process that comes close to it. We can't even come close to replicating life using the exact same formulas, the exact same, duplicating the conditions that existed exactly. We cannot do it. Can't even come close. So I don't doubt that God created life. I don't think that God had an exact hand in creating people. People evolved naturally over time because of the creation of DNA and all the rest is history. But the point of the story of Genesis that a lot of people miss, because they may believe it's an actual account of human history, or they just read it and they just regurgitate it and they don't actually understand, is that humans were created special. And that special ability was to name the animals, to choose their names. And then to go on.
You're saying because God didn't have names for the animals?
He did.
So
no, because he didn't want to name them. He didn't need to
name
them.
To be the progenitors of naming all the animals.
But see, God
of the
had.
animal kingdom.
Well, God had. I mean,